What is going on, everyone? It's your guy, Cole Jackson, back here on Road Graders, and boy, do we have a lot to break down. The Baltimore Ravens make a major decision late on Tuesday, late in the afternoon, to move on from head coach John Harbaugh. I'll leave a description or a link down in the description to go watch the Ravens Collective recap. I'll kind of give you my thoughts on the move. If you guys have been following the channel for a while, you know from my videos I've done 3 probably this year about moving on from John Harbaugh. This is the decision I would have made. I'm very happy to see the Ravens moving in a new direction. But now the big question comes, who do you replace him with? And this is where it's interesting, right? We haven't done this since 2008. It's been 18 years of continuity with John Harbaugh. For the first time in a while, the Baltimore Ravens are back in the market for a head coach. And this is a big one because we've gone through the OC and DC searches over the last few years, landing us, with Zach Orr, Todd Monken, before that, Mike McDonald, Greg Roman. So this isn't the first time doing a coach search, but the head coach is just so different because it becomes so dynamic. You land on a head coach, then it becomes who's he bringing in as coordinators. A lot is going to change. The Baltimore Ravens' entire system can change on both sides of the ball. There's going to be so much to look to, so much to break down to get used to these guys. So let's dive into it. I kind of want to start just at a high level because I think there's a fundamental way of walking through, and I'll be looking forward to the comments down below, seeing what you guys think. So the first question becomes, do you want to target a retread, or do you want to target a young, guy for his first head coaching opportunity? And I think this is a really interesting fundamental question about how you want to approach this search. Now, I'll make it very clear. I think the Ravens need to cast this net extremely wide. If you remember the Todd Monken search, they interviewed a lot of people, and that's exactly how they should manage this. So I'm not saying this is where you limit yourself, but I think you want to have a target in mind. And I personally believe, based on the guys available and based on some of the recent success we've seen from people stepping into head coaching roles, I think it would be ideal to aim for a young, offensive-minded head coach. This is basically going to be their first kick at it. And, the Ravens had their own kind of defensive-minded, wonder kid and Mike McDonald in the building. Unfortunately, the Ravens make it to the AFC Championship game. They keep John Harbaugh. He goes to Seattle. Unfortunate, just the way things rolled out, that Mike McDonald couldn't have been in that future plan. But I think they want to look at who are some of these next Mike McDonald type guys. And so that's where I would be targeting it, looking at someone young. When you look at O versus D, I would personally aim for an offensive minded, as I just mentioned, because I want to get a guy in here that is going to be able to come in and fundamentally mesh with Lamar Jackson. I think that needs to be one of the top considerations as the news has been rolling out, whether you want to believe it or not. I mean, it is what it is. It seems like there was a fundamental rift between Todd Monken and Lamar Jackson, and that came to a head yesterday. There was just a fundamental disagreement. John Harbaugh did not want to move on from Todd Monken, so John was out because of that. That seemed to be a sticking point for him. So I think getting someone in here that's going to be able to mesh with Lamar Jackson, be that offensive-minded coach, and then bring in a DC. I think there's a ton of veteran DC type guys. A guy like Jim Schwartz would be a great defensive coordinator to bring in here under that offensive-minded head coach. So now let's dive into some candidates. I put in a whole swath of guys just to kind of give us that full perspective. I'm going to give you my thoughts on them, my initial thoughts. And then obviously I want to hear from you guys down in the comments. Hit that like button, hit subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. We're going to start with what I think is probably the wonder kid of this year in terms of offensive minded, and that is Klint Kubiak, the offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks, currently the OC under Mike McDonald. Klint Kubiak, very interesting background. We all know about the Shanahan-Kubiak system. Obviously, Klint Kubiak linked to Gary Kubiak, the Baltimore Ravens 2014 offensive coordinator. But what's interesting is Klint Kubiak comes in, spends some time with his dad when he first gets here in Denver. Then he goes out, gets into the pass game coordinator business, ends up in Denver again, but not under Kubiak. He's not there at this time, but then he ends up in San Francisco as the 2023 pass game coordinator under Kyle Shanahan, getting back under that tree. He goes to New Orleans last year as the offensive coordinator before landing in Seattle and starting to kind of forge his own path. Not Mike Macdonald is technically from the John Harbaugh tree, not from the Shanahan tree. So Klint Kubiak kind of takes that step out to go kind of forge his own path. Obviously, a lot to like between Klint and Mike Macdonald as two younger guys, one with an offensive mind, one with a defensive mind. And I mean, you saw the emergence of that with the Seattle Seahawks getting the number 1 seed. And then you look at the ranks and how Seattle performed this year with Sam Darnold at quarterback. He's really rejuvenated that career. 3rd in points for, 8th in yards. The offensive pass yards at 8th, rush 10th. The biggest thing here, though, that you have to pay attention to is the turnovers, which is obviously a huge concern for the Baltimore Ravens. They come in at 31st, and their EPA per play much lower than the other core ranks at 15th. But overall, Klint Kubiak just seems to be, I personally want to go from the Shanahan tree because the big reason what's going to come with that is that kind of West Coast offense, which is where I think Lamar has had so much success, and also that horizontal run game. So that outside zone stretch that Kyle Shanahan is so famous for, Klint Kubiak's running that system in Seattle. And I think that's what's led to some success, despite the injuries to Kenneth Walker. I know a lot of people look at the fantasy football outcome, but they've been able to be pretty effective as a rush offense between Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And they've been able to do very well in the red zone as well. So I think that Klint Kubiak in this scenario makes a ton of sense as that kind of young offensive mind to bring in here. And I think the nice thing is him having that play calling experience from Seattle and New Orleans is a big piece. And then when we move into our second guy, another whiz kid, Mike LaFleur, also coming from that same Shanahan tree. He was the pass game coordinator and the wide receiver coach from 2017 to 2018 in San Fran. 2019 to 2021, he was the pass game coordinator in San Francisco. Then he goes with Robert Saleh, who is also from the Shanahan tree after being the defensive coordinator, and he is that offensive coordinator for Saleh in New York with the Jets. I think you could look at that and have some criticisms over that setup in New York. I think you could look at that and say, I mean, Mike LaFleur already got his shot to kind of go run an offense. But I mean, there's only so much you can do with Zach Wilson. And they were really hamstrung by the fact that it is the New York Jets. They have Zach Wilson at quarterback. Zach Wilson, obviously not an NFL caliber quarterback. So then he goes back to the Rams. And I think one of the big criticisms that you can have about Mike LaFleur is Sean McVay is calling those plays for the Rams. Mike LaFleur hasn't really had that play calling experience in the last couple of years. He did for the Jets with Saleh being the offense or the defensive minded coach, but he hasn't in the Rams. And so I think that's a very valid concern, but he does bring a lot of those tendencies that come from that Shanahan tree that I'm very interested in. Similar run game type thing. And then you look at the success that the Rams have had this year. 1st in points for, 1st in yards. Pass O is 1st, 7th in rush O, 4th in protecting the football and turnovers, 2nd in EPA per play. Again, you can look at that though and say that's the influence of Sean McVay. Mike LaFleur might not be ready to go in and execute. He's also very young. So I think there's a lot to like there, and there's some concerns. And I think that's going to be one of the dynamics that the Ravens are going to have to, go through with some of these coordinators. Everybody's got a pro, everybody's got a con. And I think that's really what it is. But again, you're getting that guy from the Shanahan tree. I think he's one of those next up and comers to be off that tree. And I think the Ravens could strike early to try and get him in here. So another interesting name to keep an eye on. Then we go to the defensive side of the ball, sticking with some of the whiz kids. Los Angeles Chargers defensive coordinator Jesse Minter. When you look at his history, he's already been with the Baltimore Ravens from 2017 to 2020. He spent time as an assistant. It was a defensive analyst, then assistant DB coach. Then he was a DB coach in 2020. Then he goes off to Vanderbilt to get some DC experience. And then after Mike Macdonald comes back to Baltimore in 2022, Jesse Minter goes to Michigan to become Michigan's defensive coordinator under Jim Harbaugh. It was kind of like the Ravens sent them off to Michigan to get that play calling experience for a big P5 program. Jesse Minter goes there, does that for 2 years, obviously gets the national championship in 2023 before ending up following Jim Harbaugh to the Chargers and being his defensive coordinator. I think this one's very interesting because, again, another guy that is coming off that Harbaugh coaching tree that we just moved on from Harbaugh, and now he's coaching under Harbaugh's brother. I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics here, but make no mistake about it, he's been very effective for the Chargers. And I think one of the interesting things about Jesse Minter is his best player in Los Angeles right now is obviously Derwin James. He uses him exactly the way we want to see Kyle Hamilton used. And so coming into Baltimore and having the best player be basically the, I would argue, better version of Derwin James and Kyle Hamilton, I think that's very interesting. And again, kind of from that Harbaugh tree, you see how Mike McDonald uses Nick Emenware. It's just part of that kind of defensive continuity that you see from that tree. So I think in terms of if the Ravens do want to go for a defensive coordinator background with someone that, and I've heard a lot of positive things about Jesse Minter's relationship with players when he was in Baltimore, a lot of good relationships in Michigan. He obviously had to go through 2023 during the Jim Harbaugh investigation, filling in for him in one of the games as the head coach, which Sherrone Moore did as well. Obviously, Sherrone Moore didn't end very well. But I think Jesse Minter makes a very interesting case. You look at what he's done in Los Angeles this year, 9th in points against, 5th in yards, 5th pass D, 8th run D, 7th in takeaway, 7th in EPA per play. Very, very effective scheme for the Chargers. They do have some fundamental scheme issues. You saw it against the Texans a couple of weeks ago. I think that those could be closed up. Not overly concerned about them, but I think he checks a lot of those boxes in terms of, I think he's got great leadership skills. I think he's got the defensive mind that I think the Ravens would have wanted in a guy like Mike McDonald. And I don't want to say he's Mike McDonald 2.0, but he kind of seems like it. Very similar career path. And I think you get some of that upside that you wanted in Mike McDonald and the path he went in Jesse Minter if they want to kind of go back and go the young DC. And then you look at bringing in some of these potential offensive coordinator fits to come in and run the offense, where Jesse Minter is going to really leave that to his offensive coordinator to run. He focuses on the defense. There's been heavy linkages to Kliff Kingsbury from Diana Rossini last night. So, I mean, I do believe that there are those linkages, because you saw, can't think of his name, is a Broncos reporter. He tweeted about how, it was for an offensive coordinator role, not as a head coach, which I will talk about Kliff specifically here soon. But, pairing him with that type of role, I have my reservations about Kliff that we'll look at here soon, but that type of approach might be what the Ravens want to aim at. Moving on here, we get into some of the more, I'm saying retreads. I don't mean that as an insult. I just mean guys that have already kind of been a head coach in the past and don't fit that young gun. And then we get to Brian Flores as that guy. Obviously he's from the Belichick tree, spent a lot of time in New England throughout the 2010s, ending there as a defensive coordinator under Bill Belichick, goes into Miami, New England's rival, is the head coach there running his defense. It did sound like, and I mean, this isn't, you just have to Google it. This isn't hidden secrets or any sort of source information. There were a lot of issues between Brian Flores and some of his players. There were rumored communication errors between him and his coordinators and the general manager. There were issues with delegation and that sort of thing. So, that's kind of where he ended up in Miami. He gets that reset year in Pittsburgh, and then he goes into Minnesota, and he's been a fantastic defensive coordinator since getting to Minnesota. And so I think that's what the interview process is for. And that's why you send this, you expand this net so wide. So you get the idea, not just from Brian Flores, but some of his colleagues. What's he been like in Minnesota? What was that like in Miami? Has he learned those lessons? Has he developed? That can absolutely happen. And that's what I don't want to see is, just crossing a guy's name off the list because of one bad experience. So I think looking at Brian Flores makes a ton of sense. You look at, I messed up there. It should say Minnesota's 2025 ranks, 7th in PA, 3rd in yards. Their pass D was 2nd. Rush D was 23rd, 10th in takeaways, and 4th in EPA per plays. With a bad offense in Minnesota, Brian Flores put together a very, very good defense. And again, if they want to go that route of, getting a Brian Flores and bringing in an offensive mind to run the offense, work with Lamar Jackson, someone probably with a QB coach background, I think that type of approach could make a ton of sense. It's not necessarily where I would go. I would lean towards the younger offensive minded guys that we've already talked about, but definitely an option. Then you get into Robert Saleh himself. He's going to start popping up on some of these lists. He's kind of rejuvenated his career after what happened with the New York Jets. Again, very similar to my comments about Mike LaFleur. It's hard to draw a lot out of his head coaching experience with the New York Jets. The Jets are such a poorly run organization and dealing with Zach Wilson, when you don't have a franchise quarterback, it's very, very tough. During that time, the Jets have been able to put together consistently good defenses. And again, if they want to go for that defensive mind where they can bring in, and think about Saleh's tree being from that Shanahan tree, he works with a ton of other young offensive-minded guys from the Shanahan tree, just like he brought Mike LaFleur to be his offensive coordinator. He could very well do that coming to Baltimore with a defensive mind, bringing in someone who is an offensive-minded OC from the Shanahan tree, and you kind of kill two birds with one stone. And I think with Robert Saleh, if I understand correctly, with some of the reviews, I think some of the more positive things with Saleh is that he's got that true leadership skills. Guys follow him. If you go back, he turned that defense around with the Jets. Very poor in 2021. And then if you go look at 2022, they were fourth in points for, fourth in yards. In 2023, in his last year, 12th in points for, third in yards. Put together two very good defenses for the Jets. And again, that's in the context of a bottom-ranked offense run by Zach Wilson. So I think there's a lot to like there. Again, I like the connection of bringing in a defensive-minded guy with a young, connection to guys that are coming off that Shanahan tree, where I think that's where I'd like to go. I think Derrick Henry fits that type of scheme really well. I think Lamar fits that scheme really well. So that makes a ton of sense to me if they do go that route. Then you get into Kevin Stefanski, and this is a guy that isn't going to get a ton of love. It does feel weird to target the former head coach of the Cleveland Browns, but sometimes I think it's like, this guy's won 2 Coach of the Year awards in the last 5 years. He was the head coach of the year in 2020 and 2023. In 2023, they limped into the playoffs with Joe Flacco slinging the ball for them. In 2020, obviously with Baker Mayfield in his second year, they were able to put something good together on offense while consistently having good defenses led by Jim Schwartz. Jim Schwartz isn't going to show up on this list, but again, another guy that if they go offensive minded, would love to see as a defensive coordinator candidate. He spent his time growing up in the Minnesota tree, spent a ton of time there before becoming the head coach in Cleveland. I believe that was under Mike Zimmer when he was in Minnesota. But I mean, obviously the results in Cleveland were bad this year. They were terrible, bottom of the league in almost every category that you can see on the screen there. So I completely get it if it's like, that doesn't make sense. But he was also dealing with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback and Shedeur Sanders, who I just don't think are NFL caliber starting quarterbacks right now. Maybe one day they will be, but they're not right now. So you have to factor that in. But I do think that's where you're getting a guy that is definitely a retread, but has shown the ability to lead good franchises. I think one thing about him that I like is he's always had extremely physical teams. They've always had good offensive lines, which I think you have to think about with the Ravens and what they need to do on their offensive line. But it would feel like, because I feel like if he ended up in Baltimore with the connection with Jim Schwartz, I feel like that, are you just bringing the Browns coaches in Baltimore? That's a tough one to sell on fans. So I completely get, I'm enamored by it. I'm interested, but I understand why you guys aren't. So again, I'll be looking forward to the comments down below. And then we get into the last option, and I'm not interested in Kliff Kingsbury at all, really. But there seems to be a lot of smoke, and I think Diana Rossini is pretty plugged into this process. She talked about it. Again, the Broncos beat writer, Ben, can't think of his last name. It's 11:05 at night. I'm recording this. I just did the Ravens Collective. I'm burnt. But my biggest concern with Kliff Kingsbury is his offenses seem to to flame out pretty quick. I will say there is a good connection with the air raid offense between that and what Todd Monken did the last couple years. And I think Kliff Kingsbury has shown a good ability to work with young quarterbacks. He worked with Kyler Murray. He obviously worked with Johnny Manziel. If you go back and watch that documentary, the Untold documentary about Johnny Football, he had a good working relationship with Johnny Manziel. He knew how to work with him and work within, his schedule and make things function. So I think in terms of getting a guy that's going to come in and connect well with Lamar, I think Kliff Kingsbury probably would. But again, you look at Washington's ranks this year, and yeah, they were dealing with quarterback injuries, but that offense wasn't doing very well before the injury. And I know because I had Jaden Daniels in fantasy football. That's been the trend, right? He got to Arizona, big explosion by Kyler Murray, and then things stale out. He gets to Washington, big explosion by Jaden Daniels last year. And I mean, to be fair to him, if you look at it last year, 5th in points for, 7th in yards. They had the 17th ranked pass offense, the 3rd ranked rush offense. So it makes a ton of sense from that perspective. But again, it's always that offense is flaming out. So maybe as an offensive coordinator, I could be convinced with a good, stout, defensive-minded head coach. Like I don't really know what the connection would be. Maybe you get like a Jesse Minter and he brings that type of guy. That wouldn't make really a whole ton of sense to me. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. I'm just not interested in Kliff Kingsbury as a head coach personally. But that's what I had for kind of candidates that are kind of top of mind right now. But drop a comment down below. Who did I miss? Who's your favorite? Am I crazy? You drop the comments down below. Let's get into it down in the comments. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this breakdown. Hit subscribe if you're new here. And as always, my friends, be good to yourselves, be good to each other. Peace out, everyone.